A young bull was left with a broken horn after a brutal fight. What happened after his father, a legendary champion, found it will shock you. What happens next will leave you speechless. The cold morning air carried the faint scent of damp earth and hay, but Elias barely noticed it. His boots pounded against the frozen ground as he ran across the pasture, heart thudding harder with each step. Bramble lay ahead, motionless in the pale light of dawn, his massive body a dark shape against the frost-tipped grass. Even from a distance, Elias saw the streak of red across the bull's white muzzle, a sharp, jarring color against his usually pristine coat. "Bramble!" Elias called, his voice breaking the silence. The bull didn't stir. Fear shot through him as he closed the distance and dropped to his knees beside the animal. Up close, the injury was worse than he had imagined. One of Bramble's horns, normally smooth and curved with a natural sheen, had been snapped near the base. The jagged edge was raw, crusted with dried blood, and the skin around it was swollen. Elias reached out carefully, letting his fingertips graze the rough break, and a chill spread through him, not from the cold, but from the unnatural wrongness of it. Bramble lifted his head slightly, letting out a low, pained snort. Relief washed over Elias that the bull was still alive, but it was quickly swallowed by dread. This wasn't the kind of injury an animal got from butting heads with another. The break was too clean in some places, too forceful in others, as if deliberate hands had been involved. Behind him, the crunch of boots on frost announced his father's arrival. Owen Grant stopped a few feet away, his weathered face tight, his eyes scanning Bramble from head to hoof before settling on the broken horn. His jaw clenched. "What happened?" Owen's voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, controlled anger, the kind that made Elias uneasy. "I don't know," Elias said, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze. "It doesn't look like he fought with another bull. This feels different." Owen knelt opposite his son, his large hands steady as he inspected the injury. The old farmer didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was quieter but no less firm. "Get him to the barn. I'll check the rest of the herd." Together, they coaxed Bramble to his feet. The bull obeyed slowly, his movements stiff. Elias took the lead rope while Owen walked alongside, his eyes scanning the open pasture with the same focus as a man tracking a predator. The air was still, but Elias felt a strange weight pressing on the morning, a heaviness that seemed to say something had gone very wrong here. Inside the barn, they settled Bramble into a stall, laying fresh straw and checking his water. The light that filtered through the slats painted thin lines across the bull's hide. Elias brushed a hand along Bramble's side, murmuring soft reassurances. The bull's breathing steadied, but every so often, his head gave a small twitch toward the injured horn. Owen stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the bright field beyond. "Check the fence for signs," he said, not looking back. Elias nodded, pulling on his gloves as he stepped outside again. The pasture stretched wide, bordered by sturdy wooden rails and metal gates. He walked slowly, his eyes sweeping the ground, looking for anything that seemed out of place. At first, there was nothing but patches of frost and hoofprints. But when he reached the north gate, he stopped cold. In the damp earth just beyond the fence, deep impressions marked the ground. Bootprints, larger than his own, larger than Owen's. The weight behind them had pressed the soil in hard, the edges slightly blurred where frost had begun to melt. He crouched, tracing the outline with his gloved fingers. The size, the depth. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing by. They had lingered. "This was no accident," Elias muttered under his breath. His mind immediately went to one name, Merrick Doyle. Merrick had been Owen's rival for over a decade, losing to Bramble year after year in livestock competitions. Elias had grown up hearing his father's curt dismissals of Merrick's boasts and bitter comments, but the man's resentment had never crossed into anything truly dangerous, at least not until now. Elias straightened, scanning the tree line beyond the pasture. It was quiet, too quiet. He couldn't shake the image of Merrick's face the last time they had crossed paths, at the feed store, just a week ago. Merrick had leaned against the counter, smirking as he spoke to another farmer. "No animal stays unbeatable forever," he'd said, his tone light, but his eyes cold. At the time, Elias had dismissed it as empty talk. Now the words clawed back into his mind like a warning he should have heeded. He walked back to the barn, his boots crunching on the frozen grass. Owen was there, rubbing Bramble's neck in slow, deliberate strokes. The bull shifted his weight, clearly favoring one side, but his eyes followed Owen with trust. "What did you find?" Owen asked without turning. "Bootprints," Elias replied. "Big ones, north gate." Owen finally looked at him, his gaze steady and unreadable. For a moment, the barn was silent except for Bramble's slow breathing and the distant call of a crow. Then Owen's eyes hardened. "Keep that to yourself for now," he said. "We need to be sure before we point any fingers." Elias wanted to argue, to say they couldn't just stand by, but something in his father's tone stopped him. Instead, he nodded slowly. That night, as Elias lay in bed, the frost already reforming outside, sleep refused to come. He kept seeing the broken horn, hearing the crunch of boots in the soil, and replaying Merrick's voice in his head. The man's words had seemed harmless then, almost forgettable. But now, they sounded like a promise. A quiet threat Elias had failed to take seriously. He closed his eyes, but the image of Bramble's injury burned behind them, sharper than the cold. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the memory of overhearing Merrick in the feed store a week earlier, bragging about how no animal stays unbeatable forever. The words had sounded like petty bitterness then, but now they felt like a warning Elias had failed to take seriously. The morning sun had barely risen when Elias knelt in the pasture again, tape measure in hand, cold breath curling in the air. The boot prints were still there, pressed deep into the soil beyond the north gate. He measured each one with care, jotting the numbers in a small notebook. The size, the stride length, the way the heel dug in, it all painted a picture of the man who had stood there. These weren't the prints of a passerby. Whoever had been here had lingered with purpose. Owen stood nearby, arms folded, his shadow stretching long over the frost-covered grass. "We'll have to do this ourselves," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but Elias could hear the strain underneath. "The sheriff won't touch it." They had already been to the sheriff's office that morning. Sheriff Colton, polite as ever, had listened with a faint frown, leaning back in his chair while they explained about Bramble and the prints. But when Owen mentioned Merrick Doyle, the man's eyes had flickered, just for a moment, before settling into a careful neutrality. "Merrick's well-connected," Colton had said, almost apologetic. "Friends on the county council. Without solid proof, there's nothing I can do that won't get overturned before it starts." On the walk back to the truck, Owen's jaw had tightened, but he hadn't said a word. Elias had understood. If the law wouldn't help, they would have to build their own case. Now, back in the pasture, Elias took photographs of the prints from several angles, making sure to include the surrounding fence line for reference. The ground was still soft from the week's rain, and the impressions were clear. He would need something to compare them to, something undeniable. That opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon he drove to the livestock auction in Redwater. The pens were crowded with cattle, their low calls mingling with the murmur of men haggling over prices. Elias kept to the edge of the crowd until he spotted Merrick. The man stood near the far pen, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing his usual dark coat and work boots. Elias watched as Merrick leaned down to inspect a calf, the heavy sole of his boot sinking into the dirt. He waited until Merrick moved on before walking over, pretending to examine the animal. His eyes went straight to the boot print Merrick had left behind. Same size, same depth. The tread matched the pattern from the north gate exactly. Elias took another photo, his pulse quickening. It was a match, but it still wasn't enough. Boot prints alone wouldn't tie Merrick to the injury. By the time he drove back to Ashridge Valley, the sky was streaked with orange and purple. Owen was waiting in the barn, brushing down Bramble, who stood calmer than the day before. Elias showed him the photos. "It's him," Owen said after a long look. "But you're right. We need more." That night, Elias made his decision. If Merrick had come once, he could come again. And this time, Elias would be ready. He chose a hiding spot behind the old water tower, just beyond the pasture's edge. From there, he could see the north gate clearly, yet remain hidden by shadow. He took a pair of binoculars, a thermos of coffee, and waited. The first night passed in silence. The moon cast pale light across the empty field, and every creak of the wooden structure above him sounded louder than it should. He stayed until the cold numbed his fingers, but no one came. The second night was the same. Stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the dry grass. By the third night, Elias was beginning to think Merrick had decided the risk was too great. But then, in the middle of the night, a faint metallic click broke the quiet. The north gate swung open. Two figures slipped through, their movements quick and purposeful. Even in the dim light, Elias recognized the taller one instantly, Merrick Doyle. The second man was shorter, stockier, his steps heavy on the ground. They didn't approach Bramble's pen this time. Instead, they crouched near the fence, speaking in low voices. Elias lifted the binoculars, straining to see their faces clearly. Merrick's head turned, the light catching the sharp lines of his features. Elias adjusted his grip, trying to catch every word. "Next time." Merrick's voice carried just enough to be heard. "No trace. Competition over. The other man nodded, muttering something Elias couldn't make out. A slow, sick feeling twisted in Elias's stomach. This wasn't over. Merrick was planning to come back, and when he did, he wouldn't just be looking to hurt Bramble's pride. He waited until the two men left the way they came before slipping back to the house. Owen was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the lamp casting shadows across his face. Elias told him everything. "They're coming again," Elias finished. Owen set down his cup, his expression turning hard as stone. "If they come again, we'll be ready," he said, his voice like iron. The next day was a blur of preparation. They reinforced the north gate with extra chains and bolts, positioned cameras in the hayloft for a clear view of the pasture, and walked through exactly how they would respond if Merrick appeared again. Elias checked each camera twice, making sure the lenses were clean, the batteries full. But even as they worked, a nagging thought kept pulling at him. Merrick wasn't reckless. He was cunning. If he suspected they were onto him, he might change his approach. That night, as Elias stood in the barn checking Bramble's feed, he found himself replaying the moment at the auction, Merrick's measured stride, the cold look in his eyes. Merrick wasn't just trying to win a competition. He was trying to destroy them. And if Elias was right, Merrick would assume they'd make some kind of move to protect Bramble. Still, Elias told himself as he closed the barn door, sometimes the best trap is the one the enemy thinks is too obvious to work. The mist clung to the air like a heavy curtain, muffling every sound and turning the pasture into a world of shadows. From behind the stacked hay bales, Elias could see barely more than the faint outline of the north gate, its hinges just a darker shade of gray against the fog. He shifted his weight silently, the cold seeping through his boots, and tightened his grip on the length of chain coiled in his hand. Beside him, Owen crouched low, one knee pressed into the damp earth, a flashlight resting in his palm but not yet switched on. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching longer than the last. The cold gnawed at Elias's fingers, even through his gloves, and his breath came out in slow, controlled streams to avoid giving away their position. The only sound was the occasional creak of wood from the hay bales behind them, and Bramble's faint movements in the pen. The bull shifted uneasily, as if sensing that the night carried more than just mist. Then it happened, a faint metallic creak, sharp in the stillness. Elias's eyes snapped to the north gate just in time to see it swing open. Two figures emerged from the darkness beyond. The taller one moved with a predator's confidence, and Elias didn't need a second look to know it was Merrick Doyle. Beside him, a shorter, stockier man trudged forward, his gait heavy. The man's thick frame and the way he hunched his shoulders against the cold were instantly familiar. Roderick Vance, known for doing odd jobs on other men's land and for always seeming to be where trouble brewed. They closed the gate behind them with deliberate care, not making a sound. Elias's pulse quickened as they moved toward Bramble's pen, their boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The mist seemed to swallow their shapes, but he could still make out the glint of something in Merrick's hand as he drew it from his jacket. The object caught a sliver of moonlight filtering through the fog, a hacksaw. Elias's throat went dry. This wasn't just another attempt to scare them or injure the bull's pride for competition. A hacksaw meant permanent damage, the kind Bramble could never recover from. Bramble gave a low, uneasy snort, shifting his weight from hoof to hoof. Merrick and Roderick ignored it, moving steadily closer. The sight of that hacksaw was enough for Owen. Without looking at Elias, he gave a short, sharp nod, the signal they had agreed on. The paddock erupted in sudden, blinding light. Floodlights mounted on the fence posts roared to life, cutting through the mist and casting everything in harsh white glare. Merrick froze mid-step, his arm stiff at his side, while Roderick flinched, one hand coming up to shield his eyes. "Evening, Merrick," Owen's voice rang out, cold and steady. Roderick's first instinct was to run. He spun toward the gate, but Elias was already there, moving out from behind the hay bales, the chain in his hands taut and ready. "Not this time," Elias said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering through him. For a moment, no one moved. The mist swirled under the floodlights, and Bramble's heavy breathing filled the silence. Then Merrick's expression changed. His surprise melted into something else, a smirk that didn't belong on a man caught in the act. "You think the sheriff will do anything?" Merrick asked, his voice dripping with confidence. "He owes me more than you know." The words landed like a weight in Elias's gut. His grip on the chain tightened. Could Merrick be telling the truth? If so, all the evidence, all the effort to catch him, could mean nothing. Before Elias could react, Merrick lunged, not toward him, but at Owen. The move was sudden, a burst of violence meant to knock Owen aside and break free. Owen staggered back but recovered instantly, sidestepping and grabbing Merrick's arm. The two men grappled, boots sliding in the wet dirt. The struggle was short but fierce, ending with Merrick face down in the mud, Owen's knee driven into his back. Roderick took a step forward, but Elias swung the chain up between them, his stance unyielding. "Stay where you are," Elias warned, his voice low. Roderick hesitated, his eyes darting between Merrick pinned on the ground and the open gate just yards away. Finally he stepped back. Elias moved in, looping the chain around Roderick's wrists with quick, practiced motions. The man's breathing was heavy, his shoulders tense, but he didn't resist. The minutes stretched again as they waited for the sheriff. Owen kept Merrick pinned, the older man's face set in grim determination, while Elias stood beside Roderick, keeping one eye on him and the other on the north gate. When the crunch of tires on gravel finally broke the silence, Elias felt a surge of relief, short-lived relief. Sheriff Colton stepped out of his truck, his flashlight cutting through the mist as he approached. His expression was unreadable. "Caught them in the act," Owen said, his voice sharp. "We've got the hacksaw. We've got them trespassing." Colton raised a hand. "Let them up," he said quietly. Elias blinked. "What?" "Let them up," Colton repeated, his tone calm but firm. He looked at Owen, then at Elias. "You need to let this go. I'm telling you for your own good. Stay out of trouble." Elias felt the cold seep deeper into him, though it had nothing to do with the mist. He stepped back slowly, his mind spinning. Was Merrick right all along? Owen rose reluctantly, keeping his eyes locked on Merrick as the man stood, brushing mud from his coat. The smirk returned, more deliberate this time. As Merrick walked past Elias toward the open gate, he slowed just enough to lean in slightly, his voice low but clear. "This is far from over." And as Merrick walked free, he shot Elias a cold smile, as if promising this was far from over. The humiliation stung worse than the cold night air. Owen stood in the dim glow of the barn's single-hanging bulb, his breath rising in quick, frosted clouds. He had not slept since the incident. Elias was beside him, hunched over the small desk in the tack room, replaying the footage on the battered laptop they'd hidden there. The whir of the hard drive filled the silence between them. On the grainy video, Merrick and Roderick appeared, shadows moving with calculated intent. They didn't just happen to wander into the paddock, they moved like men on a mission. Merrick's gloved hand clutched a hacksaw, the metal glinting when it caught the light. Roderick scanned the fence line, his head turning sharply at every distant sound, as though expecting someone to intervene. But no one came. Owen's jaw tightened. He had seen many things in his years of working livestock, injuries, sickness, accidents, but this was deliberate harm. The stillness of his stance hid the storm inside. "We're not handing this to the sheriff," he said at last, his voice low, steady, but edged like a blade. Elias glanced up, eyes catching the faint reflection from the screen. "You don't think they'll act?" Owen gave a dry, humorless laugh. "If the sheriff wanted to act, he would have done it the night it happened. We'd just be giving Merrick another chance to twist the story." Elias nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Owen meant. The cold truth was that the system here was tangled. Friendships, favors, debts. Merrick had all three working in his favor. They couldn't fight him where he was strongest, so they changed their ground. By morning, they were in the loft above the barn, the laptop balanced on a hay bale, working in near silence except for the click of keys. Elias cropped the footage carefully, removing any shots that showed their own faces or property markers. Owen dictated the message, short, factual, leaving no room for speculation. They didn't sign it. They didn't have to. When Owen clicked send, the file shot off to more than a dozen email addresses, officials from the Regional Livestock Competition Board, neighboring event coordinators, and even a few breeders' associations. By the time the winter sun rose above the horizon, the evidence was already spreading. The backlash was swift. 3 days later, news reached them in a way Owen found almost poetic, through the quiet murmur of other farmers at the feed store. Merrick had been banned from every regional event, disqualified from current competitions for acts of deliberate cruelty, his name posted publicly on the association's bulletins. The shame would travel faster than any official letter. Still, Owen knew that humiliation was only a wound to the pride. It wasn't enough. That night, while Elias swept the barn aisle, a sound of tires crunching over frozen gravel drew his attention. The mailman's truck, a day earlier than usual, rolled up to the gate. He left without a word, just slipped a thick, sealed envelope into their box. Elias carried it inside, its weight heavy in his palm. "You expecting anything?" he asked. Owen shook his head and took the envelope. The paper tore with a sharp rip, revealing a neat stack of photocopied documents. Elias leaned closer as Owen spread them across the table. They weren't anonymous threats or sympathy notes. They were far more dangerous: breeding records, transfer papers, and forged pedigrees. Owen's eyes hardened as he scanned each page. The dates, the names, the registration numbers. All of it pointed to the same scheme. Merrick had been using offspring from Owen's bulls for years, secretly breeding them, then falsifying records to claim them as his own. Every calf sold under those lies was another profit stolen from them. Elias whistled softly. This is worth more than just a ban. Owen's lips pressed into a thin line. This is worth everything he's taken from us, and more. They could have gone to the sheriff, but that would have been like throwing their winnings into the wind. Instead, Owen turned his attention to a place Merrick had no control, the Regional Agricultural Board. The process there was clean, procedural, immune to the small-town favors Merrick thrived on. For weeks, Owen and Elias gathered every scrap of proof, dates that lined up too perfectly, sales receipts tied to false pedigrees, photos of the calves alongside Bramble's unmistakable markings. The board didn't drag its feet. The hearing was brisk, almost clinical. Owen sat with his back straight, speaking plainly, answering questions with facts and figures. Merrick, red-faced and sweating, blustered and barked, but the more he talked, the more tangled his story became. The evidence spoke louder than his protests. When the ruling came, it was like a gate finally swinging open. Owen won, not just damages, but the return of several stolen descendants of Bramble. The first day they were brought back, Bramble stood near the fence, watching the younger bulls as though recognizing some echo of himself in them. His broken horn, still jagged from the night of the attack, caught the pale winter sun. He was thinner, slower, but carried himself with a quiet dignity. Owen leaned on the fence beside Elias, the frost crunching under his boots. Neither spoke for a long while. It was never just about the ribbons, Elias said finally, his breath forming little clouds. Owen nodded, eyes still on Bramble. Number. It was about making sure no one thought they could take from us and walk away. In the cold light of the pasture, the victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a return to something steady, something unshakable. Elias, watching the bull graze, realized that the fight had never just been about winning competitions. It had been about standing their ground when no one else would. Merrick's downfall was complete, but the Grant's resolve was stronger than ever. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of family bonds, resilience, and the power of love in the face of injury and hardship. This narrative aims to highlight the extraordinary strength found in unexpected places and the deep connections that exist within the animal kingdom.